Welcome back to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. We are in series 4 of the podcast and our second series on names in the Bible and the ancient world. And this is episode 2. Last time I was with George and James, George Heath-Whyte and James Bejon, and we were talking about names in the Neo-Babylonian era, in particular the change of names of Daniel and his friends. And what's going on there. So today we're going to start in the Babylonian world again, talking about some of the names of the gods there, and we'll also talk about some of the names of God in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament as well. So good morning, gentlemen. Good to have you with us again. And we're going to talk about the names of God. So, George, kick us off then. You know all about Marduk and Bel and Nebo and all the other gods of Babylon. So give us a roundup of the Babylonian gods and in particular their names.
Well, I mean, if I were to do that fully, we would be here for hours because
That's
one thing about the
fine.
Babylonians is, I'm sure everyone would love that, is they had dozens and dozens and dozens of different gods. Some were more important, some were more popular. Some, had particular functions associated with them. Some were associated with particular shrines. It depends on what angle you want to approach it from. I suppose there's different levels of Babylonian religion, and perhaps the level we see often from the Bible is the cult of Babylon itself. So as well as some sort of universal pantheon of gods, each individual city within Babylonia would have at least one temple, often quite a few, and within each of those temples, we use the word temple, they're just houses of these gods. They had the same sort of architecture as a palace often. And statues of these gods would be in these temples. You'd have one major deity surrounded by his family, various other attendant deities. So Marduk was the patron god of the city of Babylon. He's often called Bel within that role, which means Lord in Babylonian. He had his wife, S4E2, also called Beltu, which we discussed within the context of Daniel. Belet Sha'utzu may or may not be the name of Daniel. But they also had various other gods within that temple. There were other temples for various different gods and goddesses in the city. Nabu, who appears in the name of Nebuchadnezzar, was the patron deity of the city of Borsippa, another major Babylonian city. Also the god of writing and scribes, that sort of thing. And he's also Marduk's son within the theology of the Babylonians. And so those two gods, as Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, becomes, because Babylon's the capital city of the empire, the patron god of the Babylonian state and the empire. Nabu, his son, is not just his son and so important within that world, but also very, very popular. We see this, he appears more than any other god within personal names of Babylonians, more so than Marduk, even though he's the
Any
son.
idea why?
Well, so there seems to be something within the Babylonian worldview that quite likes young, energetic gods who are like the crown prince, as it were, who can go off and fight baddies. And Marduk originally had been that. So he's the sort of the young son who comes along and defeats Tiamat, the sea, and saves all the gods from that. And he becomes king because of that. It's possible that by this sort of 6th century, the time of the exile, Nabu, who is the son of Marduk, has started to take over that role. He is now the plucky young warrior hero who, so he's sort of popular in names. But so Marduk, Nabu, and then the third god of the Babylonian triad is called Nergal, and he is sort of an underworld warrior deity who is the patron deity of another city in the region around Babylon and Borsippa, Cutha. And those three gods are the main gods of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, so people like Nebuchadnezzar. But as I said, they literally dozens and dozens and dozens, and books could be filled with the names of their gods and major gods, minor gods, demons, those sorts of things. Yeah.
And books have been filled.
They have been, indeed.
The dictionary of deities and demons.
Exactly, yeah.
Many people are familiar with the Ishtar Gate or images of the Ishtar Gate, which is I absolutely love going to the Pergamon Museum.
I've never been
in Berlin.
Yeah,
Just to stand in front of it is extraordinary. On the gate itself, there are Mashushu. Is that right?
Yeah.
And that's Marduk's kind of pet, is
little
it?
pet dragon.
Yeah, right.
He does look like a pet as well, very cute little dragon.
He's very. I would like one myself, to be honest.
I would, yeah.
And then there's a bull which is for Adad. So he's the storm god. He's not one of the major ones, but he's significant enough to put on the gate.
He is a major deity, but you have these three Marduk, Nabu, Nergal, who are sort of dynastic gods, but Adad had always been one of the very major deities. So you have the sun god Shamash, the moon god Sin. There's loads of them. Yes, and within the sort of major pantheon, Adad is and Ishtar, this goddess whose gate it is.
Yeah, who's represented by the lion then in the processional way.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And often they'll have animals associated with them. They'll have symbols associated with them. So Marduk was not just worshipped in the form of an anthropomorphic image within his statue, but also in the form of a spade. So and Nabu in the form of a stylus. So if you went to certain temples around Babylonia, they might have an anthropomorphic statue for the main deity of that temple. But then most shrines in Babylonia would have a shrine. Temples in Babylonia would have a shrine to Marduk, and in most of them, other than in Babylon, is probably in the form of a spade like a little pointy arrow-shaped spade.
Right.
And they'd give offerings to this spade and so forth. Put clothes on it.
Well, that's very interesting. I acquired the other day a rather nice old spade with a lovely wooden handle.
Don't worship it.
I'm kind of anxious about how to treat this spade.
Tempting as it may be. Try not to.
I think I would call the spade a spade and keep it at that. So tell us about the anything about the names of these gods. Are these names just functioning as labels for them? Are there meanings that can be drawn out?
We should say,
and what happens with those names within the culture?
Just interrupting briefly, readers of an English Bible will know Marduk as Merodach, probably, and that's the same name. It's probably actually a more ancient pronunciation than we get in Babylon, isn't it? So that middle vowel, the long O, has sort of dropped out, where people are more common with the name. So just as people have kind of shortened names for localities, like, I don't know, New Orleans rather than New Orleans and so on.
Just trying to think where that comes up. In relation to the Babylonian envoys, is it in Hezekiah's time?
So, I mean, within that name, Merodach Baladan is a Babylonian ruler called Marduk Apla Idina in Babylonian. Again, as James says, we don't often know how the name Marduk was said out loud because of the way the cuneiform writing system works. The spellings that we do have that give us a clue to pronunciation suggest that Marutuk or something like that would have been common. So with this vowel in there, so Merodach Baladan. But also he appears in Isaiah and Jeremiah in prophecies against the gods of Babylon.
Right.
Yeah.
But sorry, I interrupted you. You were going to...
Yes, so names of the gods. It's interesting. Unlike names of people in Babylonia and much of the ancient Near East, names of particularly Babylonian gods, perhaps less so with others, weren't obvious necessarily. The meanings of the names were not obvious. Okay. So Marduk, it probably means something like the calf of Utu. So Amar Utu is how it's spelt. Utu being the old Sumerian name of the sun god. And we get clues in certain texts that was one way in which Marduk was thought about as the son of the sun god. But that's not his main, the theology about him, that's not the sort of the main branch of ideas. He's Ea's son more traditionally rather than the sun god's son. We see their kind of, we often see them try to work out what the names of deities meant. But Marduk, more than any other god, was provided with many, many different names. And this is something that seems to have been a thing with Mesopotamian deities, that the more names you give a god, the more roles that they have associated with it. So, and particular names were associated with particular functions of the god. So Marduk is his sort of main name, but he also was called Asaluhi, which was a name associated with his role as a god of healing and magic, things like that.
Interesting.
The planet Jupiter was thought to be a manifestation of Marduk, and when they're talking about the planet, they often call him Neberu, which is another name, means crossing or something like that. The name Baal, very popular name for him, at least in certain contexts, I've suggested was associated with his role as the patron deity of the city of Babylon rather than his manifestation anywhere else. But in the most famous text about Marduk, Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, he's provided with, well, a few names throughout the course of the story, but at the end, the story tells of how he became the king of the gods. And when the gods finally bow down to him, the big finale is he's given 50 names by various different gods. Before that, he's given the name Lugal Dima Ankia, which means king of the gods of heaven and earth. And then he's given 50 names. Some of them have obvious meanings. They seem more like titles to us. And some are quite obscure. And the last name, the 50th name, is Bel Matati, the Lord of the Lands, and that's given to him by Enlil, whose symbolic number is 50. So he's given these 50 names. Enlil used to be the king of the gods and the supreme deity of the pantheon, and so he's surrendering his role to Marduk, who's given all these names. And in other texts, we see that some Babylonian theologians seem to have thought that the other major gods of the pantheon were just names of Marduk. Marduk is this sort of big overarching god.
Really?
And so gods like Adad or Sin, Shamash, the moon and the sun god, they were just names for Marduk in his role as god of war or whatever.
Right. That's very interesting. I've not heard that before. We'll come on to names of God in Scripture in a moment, but there are some obvious parallels already that I'm seeing that maybe it's not always easy to figure out what the names of God, where they're from, what they necessarily mean. Some are more obvious than others, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And of course, God also has many names.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there are parallels and comparisons to be made. I think we've got to be careful not to sort of try and import Babylonian, Mesopotamian ideas about gods into the Bible. Yeah. Even if, we were being here as critical scholars, not believing the Bible to be God's word, that would be a dangerous thing to do, just because different cultures, even within Mesopotamia, differed on what a god was, how they interact with them, how divine names work. The Assyrians had very different views to the Babylonians. Different Babylonians in different periods had different views. I think there's often a danger we take things like the Epic of Creation, think, oh, look, this is how divine names worked in the ancient world. Right. This must be how it's working in the Bible. Yeah. There may be comparisons to be drawn, and similarities. But,
here's a potentially dubious connection that you could probably comment on. I've heard it said that the name of Marduk was so holy that it wasn't pronounced, and that there's therefore a parallel with the divine. Is there anything to that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. So that's often brought about, and so in connection to the name Yahweh, which we'll get onto a bit more, we know that when at some point in time after the Bible was written, perhaps it became thought of within Jewish communities that name was too holy to be said out loud, and so in the manuscripts of the Bible we have the consonants of that name, however it was pronounced, but the vowels of the Hebrew word for Lord, Adonai, written underneath it. And so when someone reading Scripture would get to the word that we see in our translations with the capitalized Lord, they would say Adonai rather than Yahweh. Now, it's been suggested that, this is something similar to what's happened with Marduk. Marduk comes to be known as Baal, which is the Babylonian word for Lord. And this is a similar sort of thing. Well, Marduk is too holy a name to say, and so they call him Baal instead. The problem with that is they never stop calling him Marduk. They call him Baal, and that seems to have been a name. And I I've suggested that it's a name associated with a particular role of his, but in almost all periods, and in texts that he's called Bel, he's also called Marduk, and so doesn't ever seem to have been the case that Marduk was too holy to say, but rather in particular contexts he was called Bel, and in particular contexts he was called Marduk.
So you're saying that Bel is a name, not a title. It's not just Lord, but it is actually his. It is an alternative name for him.
The way it's written in the cuneiform script suggests that it was seen as a name. So we might have mentioned in previous episodes that divine names in the cuneiform script get written with something called the divine determinative, which is the little cuneiform sign for God.
Right.
And that gets written before the names of gods.
Right.
And loads of gods were called Lord. Humans could be called Lord. If I was writing to you a letter and you were my master, I'd call you Lord. But it's only when using this, referring to Marduk as Lord in place of a name. So you might say Marduk, my Lord. You wouldn't write this little divine determinative. But if they were talking about Lord as referring to Marduk without a name, they'd write this little divine determinative. And we get, say, lists of 15 gods and goddesses. All of them have their divine names, so Adad or something. And then somewhere in the middle of that list we'll get Bel, Lord. And that these are lists written by people who didn't necessarily think of Marduk as the top god. And his position within these lists shows that. But more, this is a name of this god. Yeah, even though it had a meaning, understandable meaning.
Right. Yeah. So not everybody saw him as the top god.
Well, no, exactly. I mean, so the official position of the Babylonian state is he's the top god, but the Assyrian kings who did not see him as the top god, they would also call him Bel. Right. It seems to have been known that Bel referred to Marduk, and probably Marduk in a particular context. Yeah.
That's very interesting. And all of these names then get used in people's personal names?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this is something that's very interesting. We can tell a lot about a town or a region's religious beliefs as a whole by looking at the divine elements that appear in personal names. We can't necessarily tell you, this person had Bel in his name, therefore he was a Bel worshipper, because obviously most people don't choose their own names. And there's sort of all sorts of social reasons why. But it is the case that in most cities in Babylonia, the most popular divine element within names from that town will be the chief deity of that city's pantheon. Okay. And various other minor deities will be there as well.
Right. Yeah. So we see more Nabu names in Borsippa.
Exactly, yeah.
And more Marduk names in Babylon.
As I said, so Marduk and Nabu, yes, we do. But as I said, Nabu seems to have been popular a bit more broadly.
Okay, right.
But so in Sippar, where Shamash, the sun god, was the chief deity, we find more Shamash names than in other towns. Things like that. Ninurta names in Nippur, which was when Ninurta was worshipped. Right. Those sorts of things. And very interestingly, when we get texts from Babylonia mentioning Judean exiles, we get loads of names with Yahweh in them, and only very, very small numbers that reference any other deity. Whereas when we look at Babylonian names, we see all sorts. We see the whole pantheon of a city represented within the names of that city. Whereas Yahweh was consistently, other than maybe one or two names, the only divine name within that community, which suggests at least that we obviously we can't know about the individual's religious beliefs, whether they decided to worship Babylonian gods when they got to Babylon. But it seems that there is something unique about the way the people of Judah use their names, that there is one God that you reference in your names.
That's very interesting. We commented in an episode in the last series, one of you talked about the fact that the pattern of names within Israel had shifted from El to Yahweh names. Is that right?
Yeah,
Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, I don't remember saying it, but I think it's broadly true. Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
I mean, there's a real explosion after the exile, isn't there, in Yahwistic names? Yeah. So if you look at books like Nehemiah and Ezra, you only have to read a few names, of which there are no shortage in Nehemiah and Ezra, and compare them with, say, the list of Jacob's grandsons in Genesis 46, where you won't find a single Yahweh name. So there's something that's occurring there. Now, a number of people have tried to comment and say things about when Yahwistic names make their way into Israel's name pool. And they've tried to suggest that this really only starts happening in the 10th, 9th century and beyond. And they've tried to say, therefore, that the entrance of Yahweh into Israel's thought is a relatively late thing. And it might be worth saying, I find that problematic just because a lot of things need to happen in order for a name like Yahweh to start appearing in the Bible or the archaeological record or whatever. I mean, the name Yahweh needs to catch on within Israel's population. You know, B, people then need to start embodying it in their names, and names are a very conservative thing, you know, so that and then C, you need to get a critical mass of those enough so that they start making their way into the biblical text and into the archaeological record. And so that kind of slow burn, if you like, for me, works fine with a 15th century revelation of Yahweh's name. No problem at all. You know, that if you slowly get them building up, that would be fine. I mean, it reminds me of a article on Bedouin names that I read a while ago. So modern day Bedouin names. And the person who was analysing them, he suggested at one point that he thought that this tribe of Bedouin was not Islamic because they had no traditional Islamic names in their name pool at all. They were kind of recycling names from long before that. And they were thoroughly Islamic as a tribe, but they were just, you know, these newfangled 7th century AD names hadn't found their way into their name because you're wanting to preserve an identity and continuity with the past rather than sort of, so yeah, for me, the way it works chronologically is not a problem at all.
Yeah, interesting. Let's move on then to talk about the names of God in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, unless you want to say anything else about Babylonian gods first. So the name that God reveals for himself to Moses at the burning bush, Yahweh, is how we tend to vocalize it these days. My understanding is that we're not really sure that that's the correct pronunciation. I've heard other people suggest other alternatives, but we'll stick with that.
Jehovah is the English or Anglicised.
Right, yeah.
Which comes from the mix of the consonants written with the vowels of Adonai underneath. So Adonai or something. Jehovah, yeah.
Yes. So what is this name? I mean, it seems shrouded in mystery to some extent because the explanation given in Exodus doesn't necessarily. I am who I am. I will be who I will be is what God says. I mean, it connects well enough to Yahweh, but there seems to be some uncertainty or fuzziness around the edges. But maybe that's just my lack of because my Hebrew's too poor.
No, I mean, I think that is true, and I think that's part of the point of the thing. And in a sense, there are these long debates on the etymology of Yahweh, which we could get into, but I kind of feel like it's beside the point. I mean, if you recall, when we went through the Genesis 29 and 30 names, we were looking at names like Simeon and Levi and Judah. I think I do that with Caleb probably. But we were making the point that when people explain, when Rachel and Leah explain why they're choosing these names, what they say is consistent, sometimes with the etymology, sometimes with the sound. But the real purpose is the explanation that they, as name givers, provide. And the etymology is almost beside, and so the main thing that matters in Exodus 3 is what God says about his own name. I mean, I know that sounds obvious, but that's what we need to focus on, you know. Yeah. And when you're saying it's mysterious, I think someone has once said that it, as a name, it conceals more than it reveals. Right. And I think that's a helpful way of putting it. If I say to you, I've got a friend in London, and you say, well, tell me about him, and I say, he exists, which is roughly what I am is,
right.
It tells you almost nothing, doesn't it? And to some extent in the narrative, that's the point of it. Right. Moses wants to find out something about God's nature, and God is effectively saying, look, you worry about obeying my commands, I'll worry about my nature. And in a sense, God does worry about his own nature. He fills out that name as the story progresses. And so in a sense, it does conceal, but at the same time, it's hugely informative as a name, isn't it? I am who I am. I mean, it describes, we've thought initially earlier about how names often link a person born with the external world. Yeah. So a name like, I don't know, Jephthah might be because God has opened the womb. You know, a name like Matar might be because someone is born in the rain. So it's situated. Yahweh defines his own name with no external reference at all, because he's the God who just, I mean, that's the God who just is. That's how we get him introduced in Genesis, right? In the beginning, God, he just is there. And there's something about the name Yahweh that just brilliantly captures that, given God's own explanation of what the name,
Yeah. What do you think about the idea that God reveals that name to Moses in Exodus 3 at the burning bush, and yet the name Yahweh has appeared in the biblical record already before that, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. What do you think, George?
That's passing the buck, James.
Yeah, what do you think, James? Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, you can say that Moses, when writing the Pentateuch, has written the name Yahweh back into what occurs. That strikes me as very easy to accept in the narrative.
Right.
Part of the difficulty is that that's also done in speech, and in speech that's put on the lips of God himself. So God refers to himself as Yahweh when he's speaking to Abraham, which is, I mean, I don't mind the idea that Moses has done that when writing the Pentateuch. The alternative would just be to say that this was a lesser known name and a kind of passed out of reckoning a little bit. I mean, for me, there's a simplicity to just taking something like Exodus 6 at face value and saying, God revealed himself as Yahweh to Moses. Previously, that name wasn't known. Previously, God was known as El-Shaddai, because that will fit the pattern of names in the Bible perfectly and in the archaeological record. So we get no Yahwistic names in Genesis at all. Right. We get some Shaddai names in Exodus and Numbers. Thereafter, Shaddai names disappear entirely from the Bible and from the archaeological record, and Yahweh names slowly start making their way through. And so that idea that God was known by Shaddai, then was known by Yahweh, will make perfect sense of the pattern of the name. So I'm kind of more inclined to the latter, but we can have an argument about it.
No.
So tell us about El Shaddai as the name of God then.
Well, you know some stuff about it. Is there some precedent for this in older texts?
Well, there's been some suggestions that maybe it's this word Shaddai is linked to the word for mountain, Shadu, which some would like to take as a god of the mountains, something like that. Others have suggested link with word for breasts. But the problem with a lot of these suggestions is people are kind of trying to do a prehistory of the Bible from the presupposition that God does not exist, and that we can sort of work out how the worship of Yahweh as the one God evolved from this sort of polytheistic religion. And so people would say like, oh, well, we have this god El, and El was the sort of the head of the pantheon, this sort of older god, and we have Baal, this warrior god, and maybe Yahweh was an epithet of one of these gods, or maybe he was a separate god, and then we have this sort of mountain god, and sort of by the time the Bible gets written, all these different gods have been sort of merged into the one character. Obviously, we have no actual evidence for that. All we have is the biblical text and the names that God is called. I don't know if you if you have any better ideas as to the etymology of El-Shaddai, why he is called El-Shaddai. But if it is to do with mountains, perhaps often this idea of mountains isn't necessarily to do with a particular location, but just like people in Mesopotamia often ask the gods to send their name out sort of above the peaks, sort of just like high and sort of elevated. So potentially it's something to do with that.
And even in later biblical texts, some of the Psalms, for example, God is associated with mountains in the far north. Yeah. This is kind of the place where God comes, particularly as a divine warrior kind of character. And those are late enough. Well. Exactly. Yeah. Those are late enough that it's not about some primitive belief, is it? There's a symbolic geography going on there, it seems to me.
And if we do want to bring in sort of how names worked in, say, Babylonia, a god, we know from other cases that sometimes two gods in the way they're worshipped did merge, and so that's how one way a god could get two names. But in the case of Baal and Marduk, it doesn't seem that second name was added onto him from another god necessarily, but rather one god could be known by two different names for addressing the god in a particularly different function. So it could be that that's what's going on. Well, we talk about God with this one name when we're addressing him, when he's doing something to do with, like Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. We're thinking about God as a warrior, whereas in another context we might use a different name. It doesn't mean that you're sort of accessing a different part of God, but just sort of referencing a part of his nature.
Sure,
character.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anything more to say on the El-Shaddai kind of idea, James?
No, I mean, I think it fits well with what you're saying, that there is this revelation of who God is in the Scripture, and you don't need to see that as some evolutionary picture of religion. This can be the way God has revealed himself progressively to mankind.
We have to take the Old Testament seriously as a source of history, don't we? It's not, there's history and the Old Testament, but this is a good source.
The idea of God having one name and then gaining or being known by this other name also fits with what happens with humans within the Pentateuch as well, with Jacob and Israel and these other people that you've been talking about in the last series. People get new names, whether Yahweh is a new name or just a name that wasn't known by people. It fits within the way names work within the Pentateuch.
Yeah. Do we know at what point the Yahweh became considered so holy that it wasn't pronounced?
I don't. I've heard people say things about the way, I think, the verb to be is spelt in Daniel to suggest that there was something, some sort of reference for Yahweh's name that early. Yeah. But, I don't know how much we can conclude from stuff like that.
Yeah. It's worth saying that we have an article in Inc. magazine or on our website by Dirk Jonkind about writing the name of God in manuscripts, both in Hebrew with the Tetragrammaton using the four letters and not pronouncing it as Lord, and then going into the Greek and Latin text as well. So you can find that on our website. I think we'll draw that conversation to a close. It's been very interesting. Again, thank you very much, George and James.
Thank you.
Very good. Thanks for joining us. Please do rate, review, subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help if you review it and let other people know about what's going on. A lot of people say to me, I did not think that names in the Bible was going to be interesting, and I'm loving this series. So if that's you, write us a review and tell others about it. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.